This is Mullah Mohammad Fazal, one of the Taliban 5 when U.S. Special Operations Forces and CIA operatives faced him shortly after 9/11 in Afghanistan.
I remember he's one of the hardest looking people I had ever seen in my life.
And this is Mullah Fazal's cleaned-up mugshot before his release from Guantanamo, where he was labeled as high risk in exchange for P.O.W. Bo Bergdahl. These are the special operators who helped capture Mullah Fazal. They were in my award-winning documentary Horse Soldiers of 9/11, narrated by actor Gary Sinise.
American sentiment was, we need to go get those bastards. And that was the bottom line.
Now, for the first time, these special operators are sharing their stories with me specifically about Mullah Fazal and whether they think he'll attack again. Their photos show Mullah Fazal in the black turban during what was supposed to be his surrender negotiation to Northern Alliance warlord General Abdul Rashid Dostum on the right, whom the Special Forces were advising. But in reality, as some of the operators told me, this was really, quote, a double-cross situation.
My recollection of Fazal is that he was a petty tyrant who justified his psychopathic behavior using a veneer of religion.
Operations Officer Mark Mitchell, then a major, is now a colonel and the counterterrorism director for the White House National Security Council.
I have no doubt that he remains a psychopath. He's probably a danger to his fellow Afghans.
Communications Sergeant Paul Beck, now retired.
Mullah, Mr. Fazal, is this guy isn't a very nice person, and I really wish he wasn't still around. Sure, he was probably one of the top 10 bad guys over there.
And Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Max Bowers, their ground force commander, now retired.
You know, the Taliban came into Mazar, especially against the Hazars. There were wholesale actions of butchery and killings, and there was some real hatred, and there was a bloodlust for revenge amongst some of them. That was palpable. It had definitely had an impact.
But that guy did not want to let
him go. No, he didn't argue or anything, but you could see he wasn't comfortable with it at all.
More on Mullah Fazal's capture, but first the events leading up to this moment with the Taliban leader. This special ops team and 2 others, 34 men total, secretly rode on horseback after 9/11 in Afghanistan to rout out the Taliban and al-Qaeda after the attacks. Mitchell and Bowers' team rode with Northern Alliance warlord General Abdul Rashid Dostum, to whom Mullah Fazal later surrendered. The teams, which included CIA operatives, chased and fought the Taliban for weeks, during which the operators even witnessed a cavalry charge.
Fazal's fighters were the guys we had a standoff with.
Air Force Special Operations Combat Controller Mike Scorantino.
I remember hearing the first call on the radio of somewhere around 600 Taliban troops coming up from Kunduz before surrendering and going to the fortress. We were on that hilltop and watching the troops amass, and we didn't know if Fazal's forces were going to surrender or bring on the fight. And I was on the radio with 2 B-52s at the time, and they were doing some halo circles, doing a show of force. They were fully loaded, ready to expend any ordnance if things didn't turn out the way we wanted to, if they decided to fight.
Hundreds of Mullah Fazal's fighters surrendered.
What we didn't know that some of those prisoners that came out, there was an American amongst them.
They were brought to the fortress of Kuala Jangi for questioning by U.S. intelligence agents such as the CIA's Mike Spann. Wounded prisoners were moved to the Sheboygan prison camp.
I actually got asked by other government agencies to come with them to this prison camp to help some of the wounded prisoners.
Would that be Mike Spann and his colleagues?
Correct.
Green Beret medic and sniper Joe Young, now retired.
I heard a voice. You could tell that the accent was not there. Something just didn't quite sound right. I went over to the individuals that had brought me there. I don't quite think we have all Taliban or al-Qaeda here. He was listening to the conversation and immediately wound up scooping him up. The aftermath was it happened to be Walker.
Johnny Walker Lind, the American Taliban. According to the Guantanamo docket on Mullah Fazal, Lind positively identified Fazal to U.S. intelligence agents as a top Afghan Taliban general and a commander of Taliban forces. The team strategically split up. Major Mark Mitchell and half the operators stayed in Mazar-e-Sharif, while Lieutenant Colonel Max Bowers and the others headed through the night to the Taliban stronghold of Kunduz with General Dostum to negotiate Mullah Fazal's surrender face-to-face the next day. Combat Controller Bart Decker was ready to guide bombs onto target with a laser designator called a SOFLAM. General Dostum threatened Mullah Fazal with it.
Taliban came up while we were there in Kunduz up in the hills, came up, talked to General Dostum, and the SOFLAM was set up on the side of the hill. And General Dostum pointed at it and said, yeah, that's like a what we would say, as kids, as a ray gun. It'll evaporate you.
The special operators recall their first impressions seeing Mullah Fazal. Green Beret medic and sniper Joe Young, now retired.
We knew Mullah Fazal was important because he was the only one of the Taliban who got to have a sit-down with Dostum, Atta, and other Northern Alliance warlords on that hilltop outside of Kunduz. Those guys had treated him pretty well with respect. They had given him food and water at that time.
Special Forces Communications Sergeant Paul Beck, now retired.
I believe he was some kind of war minister or something of that sort for the Taliban in the northern area of Afghanistan. I'm sure he was probably one of the top 10 bad guys over there. At the time, I thought he was a very knowledgeable man and that we better watch out.
And Lieutenant Colonel Max Bowers, now retired, says it was tense.
There was a bit of hubris on the part of Dostum, and the Afghan tradition of parole and countersign and all of that was taking place, and it was a bit loosely run.
Mullah Fazal was to become General Dostum's so-called guest in Kunduz, but on strict terms that he would physically lay down his arms to Dostum that night. But Mullah Fazal never showed back up. Green Beret medic and sniper Joe Young, now retired, explains.
Fazal had given his word with a handshake to General Dostum that he would return at a certain time. At that time, he didn't give up as he had stated. It was a ruse, we realized. Fazal's intended purpose for these negotiations was not to give up, but it was to find out our location on top of that hill. He was going to try to overrun us. Now was the time for us, since he didn't show up, to do a show of force with 2 Spectre gunships, which were called on station, and the Angel of Death came into play at that time.
The Angel of Death was the nickname of the female navigator on the AC-130 Spectre gunship Combat Controller Bart Decker coordinated air attacks with.
And General Dostum could hear that through my handset on the radio. Yeah, he made that broadcast down to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Hey, look, a female up in this airplane is, wreaking havoc on you.
And also in this male-oriented society,
Absolutely.
How was that taken?
Oh, that's an insult, obviously, to the Afghani men. The way they, of course, the way the Taliban, used to beat down the women.
The special operators believe Mullah Fazal was amongst those Taliban leaders listening to Dostum's radio broadcast.
And they had, within Kunduz, a meeting, a headquarters meeting, and we knew this. We called it an airstrike. And this time we had an AC-130, and they were having a meeting in a house. And that opened up, and they couldn't even see the aircraft. They started running out of the house, and it was mowing them down. And they realized at that point that they could not, there was nothing they could do. If you do that, you're going to die in place.
The battle for Kunduz against Mullah Fazal's fighters was on.
There was quite a few of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda utilized fighters to neutralize those guys.
The Taliban decided that they were going to force the issue. When the shooting started and they began to fire, we felt like there was no alternative other than to strike that to rubble.
Calling in CAS, close air support, and at various times that was definitely needed.
But we were worried that based on the tactical disposition at the moment, had things changed, that it would have been a fight of very close proportion.
The reward of our efforts was the capture of Mullah Fazal.
Special Forces Communications Sergeant Chris Spence, now retired, took these photos.
Mullah Fazal, 2 days prior, had orchestrated the uprising at Quade. He had sent some fighters forward to surrender. In this ruse, while being detained at Quade, Taliban fighters attacked and killed CIA member Michael Spann.
Mike Spann of the CIA became the first American killed in action in Afghanistan.
I believe that the uprising which transpired at Quade was all part of a broader, very rudimentary but effective strategy, because they had a tremendous uprising at Kuala Jangi while we were in Kunduz.
Air Force Combat Controller Mike Scorantino, who was back in Mazar-e-Sharif with Major Mark Mitchell, remembers hearing word come across the radio, "American down, American down."
I was there to help out originally to try to get Mike Span out when he was in trouble when it originally started back in 2001. Mark Mitchell put on the quick reaction force plan together. I was with Paul Beck, Paul Syverson, and a British SBS team, and some other team guys up on the corner of the fort.
Lieutenant Colonel Bauer's men in Kunduz headed immediately back to Kuala Jangi to help as another quick reaction force against Fazal's fighters.
We would have to go back to quell this insurrection because there were some pretty diehard people. I can't overstate the magnitude of the fighting, and you'll see some photos here of the carnage that was there. And I thought we were going to lose some people during that.
After quelling the uprising, the operators persuaded General Dostum to turn his so-called guest, Mullah Fazal, officially over to the Special Forces teams. Communications Sergeant Chris Spence took these photos. He and Green Beret medic and sniper Joe Young were part of the security detail of trucks transporting Mullah Fazal and another P.O.W. Fazal's the bigger guy on the right. Joe Young explains how their group handed them over to other special operators who searched them again before boarding the plane.
I remember Mullah Fazal at that point. He was being turned over to other soft elements. He was angry and loud, and he was spitting on all of us. So he had to cover his mouth from spitting. He was hesitant to get on that C-130 when he finally agreed to stop spitting, so we uncovered his mouth once he was on board the aircraft.
That's Mullah Fazal on the left with two other high-value detainees. They were among the very first arrivals at Guantanamo. The UN wanted Fazal for possible war crimes, including the murder of thousands of Shiites. According to the Guantanamo documents, when asked about the murders, he did not express any regret. Guantanamo analysts noted Fazal was directly subordinate to Mullah Omar, the supreme Taliban leader and commander, and had associations with significant al-Qaeda and extremist personnel. If released, he'd likely rejoin the Taliban and establish ties with anti-coalition militias participating in hostilities against U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. Fast forward to today. Mark Mitchell, then the Special Forces Operations Officer, is now the Counterterrorism Director for the White House National Security Council. Colonel Mitchell was working behind the scenes on the P.O.W. Bo Bergdahl case involving that exchange of the so-called Taliban Five, including Mullah Fazal, who Mitchell, of course, dealt with when he was part of that original horse soldier mission. Colonel Mitchell gave me his assessment of Mullah Fazal now.
Stripped of his power and authority, he was pathetic and contemptible. I have no doubt that he remains a psychopath. He's probably a danger to his fellow Afghans. But he and his fellow prisoners have been off the battlefield for 12 years. In that time, Afghanistan has changed, the Taliban has changed, and other leaders have risen to the ranks while he's been enjoying a comfortable, if highly structured, life at Guantanamo Bay. So it won't be as simple as simply as walking back through the door and picking up where he left off. There's lots of Afghans, probably even a few Talibs, that have no desire to see him back in Afghanistan, much less in any kind of position of authority.
This video shows Mullah Fazal and the other detainees released to the Qatari government, where they're under a one-year travel ban.
I'm comfortable with the restrictions that the Qataris have placed upon him and these other detainees that have been released. And again, I don't think there's going to be much likelihood that they're going to get back into Afghanistan anytime before that year is up.
Well, let me ask you this regarding Qatar. Do you think that they will be able to properly monitor Fazal and the rest of these detainees so that they don't either A, escape, or B, are able to establish kind of an outside operating base to attack U.S. interests?
I think the Qataris are more than capable of keeping an eye on these guys and upholding their end of the bargain. Of course, these guys are going to, they're going to want to connect, but they're not going to be able to run operations. They're just not in a position to direct people in Afghanistan from Qatar.
Some of Mitchell's former Special Forces teammates are skeptical. Retired Communications Sergeant Paul Beck.
Without a doubt, he will be a thorn in our side. And I really can't believe he was released. In my opinion, this man is very capable of doing terrible things, and I think it was pretty insane to let him free.
Communications Sergeant Chris Spence, now retired.
I told my son I helped capture the guy on the far right. He said, "Really?" So, in retrospect, now that I know Mullah Fazal is free to return to his previous life as a terrorist, I think about all the Americans and Afghan soldiers who either died or were wounded, putting these terrorists where they belong.
Spence is referring to the first American killed in the war in Afghanistan, CIA agent Mike Spann, during that uprising at Quade Jangi, which the special operators say was masterminded by Mullah Fazal, one of those Taliban 5. Combat Controller Mike Scorantino today is still active duty Air Force, but now as a physician's assistant. He redeployed to Afghanistan last year.
From my standpoint, I think it's unfortunate that someone who fought so hard against us and probably resulted in deaths of many Afghans working with us and Americans working with us. My last deployment last year was back at Camp Span. That was actually a mile away from Quade Jangi Fort. I was there to help out originally to try to get Mike Span out when he was in trouble. Now 11 years later, I was back there, and it was an overall surreal experience. I was even able to participate and help repaint the memorial where Mike Span was memorialized in the center of the fort.
And Communications Sergeant Paul Beck, now retired.
I wonder how Mike Span's family feels about this guy being released, and he could have been the whole mastermind of the group that killed their son. I would like to know how they feel about it, because I think it's still a pretty crazy thing to release this guy.
The horse soldiers who originally captured Mullah Fazal tell me they'll be watching to see if Qatar ensures that the Taliban leader, Mullah Fazal, stays put. Alex Quade, Washington, D.C.